Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for doing that reading of Bury Me Home. We're going to start the second part of our reading, and I'm going to ask you to reflect on some of the questions that I asked the women who you read for in the script. And I'm going to ask you to answer versions of those questions. So my first question is, what is your name? When were you born? Where were you born? And additionally, where are you located currently?
My name is Christina Martinez. I was born in Miami, Florida in 1986. I'm 34 years old, and I'm currently living in Miami, Florida.
My name is Diana Khatib. I was born in 1987. I'm 33. I was born in Alameda, California, and I'm currently in Jerusalem.
My name is Kamini Ramdeen. I was born in Fort Worth, Texas. I'm 30 years old. I was born in 1989. I am currently in New York, Astoria, Queens, more specifically.
So I'd like to know a little bit about your history. So I'm going to ask you about where your parents came from. So if you could tell me that, and specifically your mother's, where did your parents immigrate from, or where did they come from? And then how did you arrive to the place that you currently are in? You can trace that journey in as much detail as you like, or as little detail as you like.
My parents were born in Cuba, Matanzas, Cuba, both of them in the same city, although they're 10 years apart. My mom came from Matanzas through a lottery system in 1963, and my father came through a boat. So it was an escape boat from Cuba to Key West, to South Florida.
And how did you arrive to where you are currently?
I was born in Miami, and although I've lived in some other cities, I eventually resettled in Miami.
So my parents are, my dad is Palestinian, and he was born and raised in Jerusalem. And my mother is Malaysian, and she was born in Johor and then moved to the capital city of Kuala Lumpur later in her life. I am currently in Jerusalem now, and I got here in a plane, and I work here. So the only reason I'm able to be here for an extended period of time as a U.S. citizen, despite my heritage belonging to this place, is because I have a work permit.
Both of my parents were born in Guyana. They actually lived in the same village, so they knew each other as children. And then they met again when they came here to the US. Both of them were students when they came here, so they went through the process of kind of finding somewhat of a footing here. My mom was really young. She was only 16. My dad was older. He was in college. He came on a student visa. And they had an arranged marriage, actually. So when they re-met, it was more of a, now you're going to marry him. And she was like, oh, know you from the village. So cool.
And how did you arrive in Queens?
So I came to Queens by a little bit of a longer story. So my dad is a nuclear engineer. My mom is a chemist. He was working at a nuclear plant in Texas while he was also doing a second, almost like a third degree there. We didn't even really live there for very long. My mom was pregnant with me at the time, so she was like, I will not stay back in Chicago. I too am coming. And they rented all their furniture there from the rent-a-center, and then they had me, and we lived there for 1 month. So I'm the most fake Texan possible. I'm born there. My time there is only on my birth certificate, and then we moved back to Chicago a month or 2 months later. My parents divorced in Chicago. So me and my mom moved to New York, and my dad later moved to New Jersey to be closer to me. And then me and my mom moved to Florida when she got remarried, and my dad at this time was already remarried. So then he moved to Florida. Then we all lived in Florida for a while. But it's kind of interesting, this question and the talk about home in the play. So for me, home was never really Florida, and I had lived in a few places by then, the only one of which that I could truly remember being New York. So when the time for college came, I was kind of like, well, I feel like you guys are like settled in your lives, like you both have your families, like I can leave and go away and not feel like there will be a huge hole, which, you know, for parents may not always be true. But when you're that age, I was like, I got to go home. Like, I want to go back home. So I moved back to New York, and I pretty much have steadily been here after college. And I work here. So it's not bad.
Thank you. I asked these women about the Liberation War of 1971 because they are the war generation, and it was the formative event of their generation. It led to the independence of a country. And soon after they left, they had to leave. So my question to you is, what would you say is the formative event or events of your mother's generation?
For my mother, it was the communist regime in Cuba. When they started taking over, Fidel Castro started taking over Cuba. And of course, that was a few years before a lot of Cubans started, you know, thinking about basically leaving. They had to get out of there. They had to get out of there. And so that definitely affected. That's why I'm here, because both my parents at some point decided, well, my dad decided on his own because he was already an adult when he made the decision to come here, to leave Cuba through unauthorized means of leaving Cuba. And my mother, she was a child, so they were in a lottery system and they were able to get out of there. But I think at least I'm in Miami, and I ended up just back here for work and everything. But in a way, it's kind of like home. It is home because although Miami drives me crazy for a million reasons, it's the kind of like the normal that I'm used to, and everything around my community in Miami. And I say my community meaning Cuban Americans who were born, raised here, the adults who brought us here, who came over and had my generation here. It's kind of like it just stems from the same trauma of leaving a communist country. So I think that's pretty much what has formulated and created my identity personally, and also my parents' identity, and just so much politics around that identity growing up in Miami as a child of Cuban immigrants.
Christina, could you say what decade, maybe that what decade you're identifying as when the revolution happened in Cuba that affected your mom?
Yeah, I couldn't say an exact year, but I can say that it was in the early 1960s. In the early 1960s. I know my dad migrated here in 1962. My mom came around that same year, either 1962 or 1963. Now, I don't know when the revolution, the communist revolution happened in Cuba. I'm probably the most, like, the person who's in least touch with my Cuban roots, just my accent, the way I speak, the way I look, and the fact that I'm from Miami. But other than that, like, I'm surprised that I've never like I don't seek those things out in many ways. And I'm not sure why, but yeah. So that's definitely like, that's it. that's the turning point for a lot of people like me who were born here, identify as American, but have that story.
So I would say there are a couple of defining events for my mom's generation. My mom was born in 1958, so she was born between 1 year of Malaysia gaining its independence from the British. It was a former British colony, and in 1957, they gained their independence. So that was a sort of defining feature of the first 10 years of her life. And then by 1969, that wave of sort of togetherness and independence, the afterglow of independence, if you will, sort of faded. And I think the second big event in her childhood was 1969, which was the race riots. And she, as a child of a mixed race marriage, I think was deeply affected by that. She's half Indian, half ethnic Malay. So I think that all of her humanity and kindness and just openness to everything that is life, I suppose, and everything that she's imparted to us, I think is largely colored by those events. Yeah.
Diana, do you know how long the race riots lasted?
I'm not sure exactly how long. I can look that up.
Sure. And you said it was at the end of the 1960s. So you said 1969.
Right. So, yeah, it was May 13th, 1969. That's when they started. And her birthday is a couple weeks after that. So, yeah, it was right around her 10th birthday.
And you've mentioned your father is from Palestine. What would you say was the formative moment for his generation?
So he was born in 1950, and so he was born as a child of displacement in the sense that the state of Israel was formed in 1948. So he was actually born en route while his mother was fleeing in a cave. She was fleeing from the countryside to Jerusalem, where she thought she'd find safety. So he was a young boy when the formalization of the state of Israel was happening. He grew up in Jerusalem through all of that, and I think that the defining event of his life was probably 1967 when the Arab armies lost Jerusalem. At which point he began to find a way out. So after 1967, his family was actually effectively made again refugees a second time for 1948, and they moved out of their home in the old city of Jerusalem, which was taken over by Israelis, into a refugee camp in Jerusalem, which still exists today, which is Shofat refugee camp.
Thank you. And if at any point...
Shortly thereafter, he found a scholarship and moved on.
I know that you were looking up like how long the riots lasted. I don't know if you found it.
I'll get back to you. I'll put that in the chat.
Yeah, you can bring it up later. Kamini.
So the formative moment for my mom, this is also for my dad as well, but I think it's really came down to Guyanese politics. Guyana was also a British colony until 1966. So my parents were born, my dad in 1958, my mom 1962. So it's like they were born and then this new nation was born. And the British didn't leave any sort of pathway for what government should look like. And prior to that, Guyana being considered Caribbean, even though it's part of South America, what they had brought in indentured servants from India, and they had African servants as well. Well, not servants, they were slaves. So there was also like this disparity of being indentured versus being a slave. And the British, because there were so few British officials and they had more indentured servants and more slaves than they did actual officials, they really played up the race card to say like, hey, Indian people that are here, like, don't trust the African people that are here. And then in the African community, they would do the same, like, don't trust the Indian people that are here. They have diseases, they'll harm you. So that mentality really lasts so much longer for generations to unlearn that. It was, that process is still unfolding before us. Those prejudices still exist. So when Guyana finally came to a point of independence and politically they were looking for who's going to take power here, the political system was all about championing race. So there's like an Indo-Guyanese candidate, and then there's an Afro-Guyanese candidate. And when an Afro-Guyanese candidate, coming from the Indo-Caribbean side of it, for this very small new country, came into power, a lot of Indo-Caribbeans were feeling oppressed because of his policies. And there was a mass exodus of like Indian people who were leaving Guyana to go to Britain and a lot to America. Fun fact about New York and Queens has the highest Guyanese population outside of Guyana. So many people came here. We came here too, we're still here, right? So I would say that that's the formative moment. And there's so much of it that I too still need to understand in terms of the history and the implications overall. But because that's like the moment that totally changed their life and changed what home was. And what home would be and what their lives would be. If they would have stayed in Guyana, would I even be here? I don't even know that. Everything would have been so incredibly different. So I would say it's Guyanese politics of the late 1960s, early 1970s.
It's just amazing to me. I mean, like when you think about what happened in those decades, like the women that you read about, 1971 was like the event, but prior to that was the independence movement, right? So they were experiencing that. And then you read Samina, she was born in 1970, so she doesn't have much memories of it, but she was born in and raised in the aftermath of independence. So she has a lot of stories from her parents and from her relatives. And it's so interesting just to hear from all of you from the different points in which your parents are from, what's happening in the world, like world history, what's happening in terms of race, in terms of state structures, in terms of independence, what's happening with sovereignty movements and independence movements around the world. So the next question I'm going to ask you is based on the question that I asked the women about where they would like to be buried. And so my question to you is, have you had this conversation with your elders? And what did that conversation, how did that go? And if you haven't, is it something that you'd like to have?
So the conversation about burials with my elders, mostly I don't really have much family here except my mom. My dad passed away recently, so it's just my mom and my grandparents at some point. I think the expected burial for us here in Miami, it's just a Catholic burial. So that's really what's expected. Most recently though, and the whole church thing, you have the Catholic burial, I don't know, I can't say traditional because not everybody follows that same tradition, but a viewing, then a big mass afterwards, and then a big like lunch at Versailles to celebrate the life of the person who passed. So it kind of goes in that motion, at least in my family. It's talked about, it's assumed, but it's not really talked about because, like, for example, it's not something that like younger people talk with their parents. It's just something, I think for my family at least, or like a lot of people I know, it's more taboo. Like we don't really talk about death because that's just like, we shouldn't talk about that. At least from their point of view. So for myself though, it's not something that I've always said, like, whatever makes you guys happy, you guys figure it out. If I die before you do, you guys figure it out. Just put me somewhere and do it quickly, and that's it. Make it cheap, don't go broke just to put me away. I'll be fine because I'll be dead. So, but other than that, for my, I think more for my parents, it's more of a ceremony, whereas for me, I'm more like practical. And I think that's just the difference between the generations. But yeah, it's not something that necessarily we talk about, but I already know based on just like previous funerals and burials, how it goes for my parents and things like that.
I see Diana's trying to come in and out. She's doing all the tech things. So as Diana's working on it, then coming and maybe you can go, and then we'll go back to Diana.
For sure. I grew up in a multi-religious family. So I have family members that are Muslim, family members that are Hindu, like my grandparents. I have family members that are Christian, like my mom.
Yeah, so, I'm on. I'm just not, because I think that it will.
It's cool. I'm having Kamini go next. So whenever she's done, you can jump in, Diana. And I think she's frozen. Go ahead, Kamini.
But everybody in my family, for the most part, wants to be cremated. That's kind of the the what I've seen be done in the past. My mom for sure has told me, please cremate me, scatter my ashes in the ocean, from dust to dust. So to dust we will become. So
Can you hear me? Because I can hear you guys perfectly.
We can hear you. We can hear you, Diana. Go ahead, Kamini.
So she has made that really clear without me having to ask. And then for my dad, actually, we've never really talked about it. Like the furthest that conversation has ever gone is like, when I retire, I will live in Guyana again. So I assume that we will, maybe now I'm inspired to sort of ask. I'm curious in a way that I've never quite been before. But yeah, so cremation, I believe, is the kind of like the golden rule for everybody, it seems. I've never like gone to graveyard to visit anybody in my family, at least. We do have family members that are buried, one that I can remember in recent past, and I was like, oh, this is so abnormal for what is I normally see happen. But I guess it's kind of like up to the holder here, like the who's dealing the cards. What is it that you want? But I would say cremation is the usual.
Sahar, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Go ahead, Diana. I just asked the question
Okay.
about having conversations with your elders about burial, if it's something that you've discussed with your own elders, and how did that conversation go?
Yeah, I have discussed it with both of my elders, my parents specifically. I mean, it went smoothly. It's one of those things that for us has been on our mind. And, granted, two very different backgrounds, very different geographical locations. My grandmother is buried right next to Al-Aqsa Mosque, right in the graveyard there. So there's a very strong religious motivation to be buried there by my father, and he's already explicitly stated that he would like to be buried here, even though his children will most likely be located in the diaspora. So it's like that the tension between knowing that your closest, most immediate won't be able to visit you, but knowing, of course, that his priorities are somewhere entirely different in terms of prayers upon your grave, daily, weekly, constantly from the worshipers at the mosque, and my mom is the same way as well. I think for her, it's more about where her immediate are. So she's kind of anywhere you. So if that happens in the States, then it'll be in the States. But yeah, it was a pretty natural conversation.
What can you imagine as you're reading the script? What can you imagine your own mother's saying, if you could? Could you hear somebody that you know saying what these women said? Can you hear your mom saying what these women said, and what was it? And if not, is there something that they said that you could see yourself saying, and what was it? And you can pull up the script.
Are we going in the same circle?
Yeah, same order. So Christina, Diana, and then Kamini.
Yeah, I can't imagine. Like no specific quote from the script, but what I did notice is just this just similarity between the characters and my own mom when it came to I would say like a photo memory of their previous home, in this case Cuba. What I did notice is between the characters and my own mom would be that the characters had more of a these specific characters more of a positive childhood memories associated with Bangladesh, whereas I think that was the similarity in that my mom also had these like really good childhood memories that were associated with her childhood, and this home that's far away that they will never go back to. And I think the difference, what I noticed is just, I think at least from Cuban immigrants who migrated here in the 60s, I would say that there's no real intention of ever going back. And that's just like a political statement for them on their part. I've always been raised with like, yeah, we'll never go back, not even to visit, like we just can never go back. That's never going to happen. And not because they wouldn't want to, but it's because it's just, if they go back, then it's the assumption that they're supporting a communist government. So that's just a big no-no. Like I've never, growing up until my 34 years of life, I've never said, hey, let's go visit Cuba. Mm-hmm. I'm afraid to say that, especially under a communist regime. So I think whereas what I noticed from the characters, just from that reading, is that I think there was the acceptance that they will not go back, but possibly one day, or maybe that would be a possibility. Whereas me growing up was like, you don't even say that. Like, you don't talk about that, you know? I think that's what I kind of found in terms of connection between the two.
Diana?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I can definitely see my mother saying, you know, bury me here because this is where you are, just like your mother said. It's certainly the feeling of home is where the heart is, home is where your beloved are. That definitely resonated with me, and it rings so true.
For me, I couldn't picture my mom saying these things, only because she was a single mom. So she was working, and, you know, with the character I played, Samina, one of the things that stuck out to me was financially strapped, but more in the way of like, she has no income coming to her because she's not working in that way. She's working in the home, which brings, you know, not financial reward, but reward for seeing her kids grow. And being there for them in that way. And not that my mom wasn't that, it's just that her life was totally different. So I didn't see the reflection of her in these characters in the way that they were speaking, but I saw so much of my paternal grandmother, because she very much lived the very same life of like doing everything for her kids, for her husband's job. That was something that really stuck out to me, was when one of the characters were talking about their husband's job and like being there in support of that. That very much reminded me of my grandmother. Something that I wrote down when we were doing the free write was like not being here for wants of their own. And I think that really reminded me of her the most, because every year, my grandmother would go back to Guyana for up to, you know, 2 months at a time, every year, no matter what. And like, that is like her happy zone. And when she's here, she's happy, but she doesn't have anything. Like, she doesn't drive, she doesn't, you know, work. Any money that she gets, like from my grandfather, she kind of like squirrels it away to like do something with later. And she lived a life of childhood traumas because of what was just going on in their country at the time. So I saw a lot of her reflected in these characters.
If someone were to reach out to you now, so I'm asking you a question, the same question I asked the ladies. If someone were to reach out to you now during this moment of the pandemic and the uprisings for Black lives, and were to say like, hey, you live in the United States and I'd like to immigrate, how would you respond to them?
Wow. I think I'm just like, I don't know if it's just the morning. I woke up on the wrong side of the bed, but I would just be like, I mean, I think if you'd asked me like a decade ago or like 15 years ago, I think I bought the idea that this was the American dream and everything was, and I would have vouched for it. And I like, you know, but personally, if we keep on with the way that things are going, I don't think I think I'm gonna be like my parents coming here. I will be having to go somewhere else personally. And I'm a believer that you work. I mean, if things are hard where you are, it doesn't matter. You should work through them and you should make them better. You shouldn't escape them. But I would be shocked, depending where they came from too, because I can understand other situations where things may be worse. This is bad, but it's not the worst place to be or worst condition. Most people, I say most, not everybody, at least in my city, where I see like through the pandemic, there was free food being given out everywhere by the schools, by different government centers. So I feel like there are resources here, but I don't know. Like, I definitely don't see, I don't see why this would be a goal for anybody at this present time at all. That's just my point of view, you know. I would definitely tell them, you know, think carefully and wait until after the election and see how things go and see what happens, what direction we're moving in.
I think from my perspective, I would say do what is true to you. Oftentimes we make what we can of the situations we're in, and the United States isn't a particularly like monogamous or sorry, rather like one, it's not one opinion, it's not one idea. So you'll find the coastal cities being very much more liberal than parts of the South or anywhere else. So it's really based on the environment you'll be going into, and it's respective to who it is that you are. So for example, how outwardly observant are you, whether you're an Orthodox Jew or Muslim, etc. The idea that we are influenced by our environments, but that as we see in the sort of battles that our parents were able to sort of wage and overcome, it's the idea that for the most part, you make of it what you can. And as one of the ladies in the script said, if you're not built for it, if you're not ready for it, then you leave, right? And that's just the reality of the situation. People come, they try. If it doesn't work out, if they miss home too much, then they go back. So for me, I would say if you have the opportunity to do so and it's one of your goals, then by all means do that. And don't allow for the state of affairs, whether it be the president and or the Karens, allow you to sort of sway yourself off the path that you envision for yourself. Oftentimes these tests are transient. And like has been mentioned before, you know, the election is coming, right? So let's see, and let's hope that perhaps things will change at a presidential level, at a national level. However, the sort of scars and movements, whether it's BLM or others, will continue to rage until the system responds to the needs of the people.
I mean, the point blank answer I would say is come. I think that if the situation in your home country is to a point where you need to escape it, come, because that's how my family got here, through presidents that were not great. And as we're living through this as a lived experience, not as something remote in a history book, you know, this sucks. Being under Trump's administration, for lack of better words, is not great. What he's done with immigration, his zero tolerance policy is nothing that I personally agree with, but I still very much believe in this country, in the reason that my parents came here, what they've endured being here, and the opportunities that it does afford. The election for president is coming up, and obviously I have my own political leanings. I hope he doesn't win, but you know, we have a Congress here. It's not the only thing that we can flip is the presidency. We can have a blue Congress, and I do have faith in that, regardless of all the rhetoric, regardless of the media. And I work in media, so I'm witnessing so much of it as it occurs. But I would say, you know, the American dream has its fallacies, just like every dream does, right? It's not perfect. It's not a perfect country. It's still America is still a young country that became a superpower, trying to figure out what it is. And the ideals of that, the opinions of that are so plentiful. But if you're in a situation that you don't know what to do, the policies of the country that you're living in don't match where you want your life to be, what you want your family to be, you know, come here. This is what this country is based on. And I don't think that I'm ready to give up on that for what I believe that the goodness of America. I don't believe that we should turn immigrants away. And I think the tide will change. And maybe I'm too optimistic, but I find comfort in that optimism. And I've been afforded comfort in the optimism that gave to the people before me who took a chance to come here. My family came through chain migration. So somebody was here already who sponsored a family member. My dad came through a student visa and then married my mom. And, you know, so I do believe that there's a way. And you know, it's all about the grind. I think people should just be ready for that. America is a lot about the hustle. So you're going to come and you have to, you know, start running as soon as you get here, and nothing is for free here. And I think that everyone, as beautiful as it is, you know, living in New York, especially, the mentality here is that you work all the time. And I think, like, as long as you have that in mind, in a way, don't not come. Don't try to look for that, you know, look for that better life here. I'm not ready to just give up on it yet. So come, we will welcome you with open arms. Maybe not Trump, but we have a great community of people here and local politicians that do want that. And I do believe in that.
So my last question, I asked you to do a free write right after we finished the reading. So you can pull that up, or you can just speak from your heart and mind where you are right now. But my question is, how did you respond to the script? What struck you? What stayed with you? What challenged you? What are some lines that you found meaning in? Tell me all that you'd like, or as little as you'd like. Oh, and we have 2 minutes left. So I think what I'm going to do, because it's going to end at the 2 minutes, is I'm going to end this session and we're going to sign back one more time. I'm sorry about that. Let's do that.